Our keynote speaker of the day is the Managing Director of ANZ Modern Engineering Practice at Accenture Australia and looks after the global DevOps practice as well as the Agile practice at Accenture in Asia Pacific. He shares his skilled experiences at international conferences and is a regular blogger at notafactoryanymore.com. He's also the author of the award-winning DevOps for the Modern Enterprise, a book that sheds light on the transformation barriers caused by legacy technology and legacy thinking, and also provides a pragmatic guidance to help companies adopt DevOps and Agile in an enterprise context. In today's session, under the able stewardship of a DevOps wizard, we are going to be plugging straight into the field of enterprise DevOps transformation and knowing steps on how to approach it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my utmost privilege to now invite onto your screens Mr. Mirco Hering.
Welcome everyone to my talk today here at DevOps India. The topic I chose today is called Enterprise DevOps, Feast of Elephants. Well, I by no means do I want to talk about eating elephants in the literal sense, but I think many of you are familiar with the proverb, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And what I've learned is that when we talk about enterprise DevOps, we're not just talking about one elephant. There's many different elephants that you're trying to eat in the proverbial sense. So many big problems to solve, and it can be quite daunting. So what I want to do in this talk is I really want to show you a couple of different approaches of how you can approach these large challenges that exist in an enterprise. So just really, really quickly about myself. My name is Mirco Hering. I'm the global DevOps lead for Accenture, and I've learned a lot in the last 18 months. I spent my time, as many of you, working from home, pretty much outside of the normal area where I work, which is in meeting rooms with clients or with my own teams, and realizing how much harder it is to actually do things nowadays if you're completely virtual. And many of these things will come into what I'm talking about to you today. If you want to follow some of the stuff that I'm doing, I have a blog on Not a Factory anymore. And to be honest, in the last year, I haven't blogged as much as I wanted to, but hopefully when things get a bit more normal, I'll be able to write a bit more. And if you're interested, you can have a look at my book as well. So let's get into this. So why is transforming at scale like a feast of elephants? I mean, the thing is, where do you even start, right? If you talk about DevOps and enterprise, there's so many different things. There's the organizational structures. There are many discussions around tools. There are discussions around technical practices, about applications, about cloud, about the culture that you want to embed. And all of that together makes many, many, many permutations of what you can deal with. So what I thought I'll do, I broke this Feast of Elephants up into 4 courses. The appetizer is really, how do you even know that you're making progress? Yeah, and I'll talk about what I've learned in many conversations with clients where they think they're making progress, but then they get stuck and they haven't really figured out how to move themselves forward. So let's talk about how you can look at this perhaps a little bit differently, and a couple of pragmatic ideas. Then we get to the soup, which is figuring out how big a bite you can chew. I mean, in enterprises, you have hundreds, if not thousands of applications and even more employees. So how do you deal with that? Then we get to the main course, which is really focusing on the right things, like making sure that you're addressing what gives you the most benefit. And that's obviously, all organizations are constrained, whether it's financially, whether it's by time, by attention, by the amount of technical talent they have. So obviously you need to be able to focus on very specific problem areas and then move on from one area to another to another. So how do you focus on the right things? And then we get to dessert. And that's something that I've learned probably the most about in the last year. And that's the power of documentation, which might feel a bit odd for a DevOps talk. We don't very often talk about documentation, or it is the proverbial documentation as code, or in code as documentation. But I have a couple of interesting thoughts on what I've learned, and perhaps you guys can take something away from my experience. All right. So before we get too deep into it, the first thing I want to say is there's two things that are always bad for you. It's kind of similar to when you're taking, when you're eating too much and you're going to kind of get the tummy ache. And in large organizations, you have so many options to take. And very often people think, but this is my one opportunity. This is the one chance of getting something right. So they are combining everything into one or two initiatives. But the reality is, if you're combining variables, it is never a good thing. It makes things too complicated. So if you're trying to move to the cloud, implement DevOps, move to an agile team, resolve all the security issues that you have in an application, implement microservices, it's just going to be too many. And what happens is you're compounding all the risk that you have of all these different things that you're trying to combine. And that means if one of these go wrong, all of a sudden, everything else depends on it. So what you should always be looking for, especially as you're doing it at an enterprise level, is how can I decouple the different things that I want to do? Yeah, and that is not necessarily easy, because sometimes you have to think a bit ahead to find opportunities to build something in a way that allows you to decouple it. Let me give you an example. I was discussing it with one of my clients, and they were trying to roll out all the good technical practices for DevOps. And they basically were trying to build a pipeline that starts all the way from provisioning an environment in the cloud to deploying an application, to deploying the application configuration, to procuring the data, the test data that's going into the non-production environments, writing a test suite, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you're trying to do all this together and you're designing it that way, then that means you have to have all these things ready before you can implement something. And that takes a long time. And potentially, you have problems with any one of these things. And if that happens, you're getting delayed across the board, right? And it's never good enough. So what we discussed is, well, can we create a pipeline where all these capabilities have kind of hooks? And so you're building that end-to-end pipeline, but most of these things are still happening manual. But then you kind of click it over and the capabilities keep moving forward. And then as the automated capabilities become available, you kind of dock them in. And now you have a completely independent way of creating that CD pipeline. Yeah, and you can fill in these individual slots with the capabilities as they come online. And even if they come online in partial capability, like test automation, it might be only smoke test and then later regression test and then more specific test suites. As long as you've defined the pipeline that you can call these different packages, then you can plug them in as you like, right? And you can call the specific scope of that test package. And that way of thinking allows you to decouple a lot of things. Yeah, and that is not just for CD pipelines. The same is true when you're changing your org structure and changing the applications and changing technical capabilities. The more you can find ways of decoupling it, the less risky it is. Yeah, and then every team can choose their own adventure, and we'll come to that a little bit later. Because one thing is true, in everything I've done myself, is that there's never only one right way to get there. Yeah, and if you believe that there's only one right way, that's a sure way to failure. Right? I've been in organizations where they try to do kind of custom development practices to package software, and that obviously doesn't work terribly well. Or where they were believing that there's only one type of org structure that can work. Either you believe in a DevOps team or not a DevOps team, or a platform team, or any of those things. The reality is, at scale, you will need to use a lot of different things. There are patterns that are wrong or less successful, and there are patterns that are more successful, but they're multiple. And so that means you need to keep an open mind about how many of these different patterns can you maintain and can you use as you're rolling something out in the organization. And that is obviously a bit tricky, because if you have a lot of stakeholders around you, they want to hear the answer. Right? They're looking for that one specific answer, and telling them, hey, there's 2 or 3 or 4 different ones. That might not always win. I had a great conversation with our technology team, and we were talking about which tools we need to support. And it became pretty clear very quickly that we had to have multiple different tools, even though the very senior stakeholders didn't like that. But for us to do the same for SAP as we do for Salesforce, as we do for Java, just didn't make sense. Right? And so we went back and said, okay, we need to have multiple tooling patterns as well that we are supporting going forward. And yes, it's potentially more expensive, but it is more appropriate. And it doesn't mean everyone can come up with their own, but it means that there's an approved multiple of any pattern or tool. All right, so if you take that mindset into your transformation journey, I think you will be more successful, and you will see that a lot of the stuff that I will talk about in this hour will come back to these points, because I'm looking for ways of making things easier, making an individual progress, so that we can make every journey a journey of individual steps, and not just this gigantic leap that we need to make. All right, so let's jump into the first course. So how do we know that we are making progress? And many of you might be familiar with the metrics that came out of the Accelerate book, where we talk about mean time to recover and the deployment time, and they are good. But I found that there's kind of 4 different categories of metrics that you can measure, and that in each of these categories there are not just one metric that matters, because every organization has kind of a bit of a different priority or a different context. But if you cover those 4 different areas, I think you have enough that you can measure whether you're making progress or not. So what are these 4? I will go through the 4 areas first, and then I will give you a couple of examples of each of the areas. So the first one is about business effectiveness. The idea here is we want to be able to find something that is useful for the organization, and then we want to use that as much as possible. Right? So you want to experiment quickly, and then you want to identify these successful experiments, and you want to expand them. Right? You want to really use them where it makes sense. And so that's the measurement that, from a business stakeholder perspective, they care about the most. Then we get to delivery efficiency. Delivery efficiency is about speeding things up and automate. That's a typical one where we talk about cycle time, where we talk about automation of the processes that we're using in our delivery. And that is something that allows you to run more experiments quickly and cheaply. Then we get to operations reliability. Well, at the end of the day, if you could put a lot of stuff out there, but none of that stuff works reliably, your customers are going away from that, or your stakeholders. So here we want to look for how quickly can we sense that something is going wrong, we can react to it, and we want to automate the treatment of it, so that when something goes wrong, that we ideally automatically can fix it. And then the last one, and that's perhaps the trickiest one, is the architectural flexibility. Here we want to make sure that we simplify the architecture so that it's easier to deal with. Remember, we want to break these variables, and we want to have things that we can develop for individual components or individual applications without having all these dependencies around it. And so we want to simplify, and we want to decouple. Yeah, and that are things where we're looking for breaking down monoliths, where we're breaking down hard dependencies between applications, where we are finding things that allows us to kind of make the glue less gluey between applications, so that you can move one forward faster while the other one is perhaps a bit slower because you're not investing as much. So those are the 4 different areas. Let me just give you a couple of examples for each of those to give you a flavor for that. So in the business effectiveness, we look for the number of experiments that we've run. And then when we run experiments, how quickly do we know that something is successful? Like, how have we built mechanisms in that show us whether our users are using the features, or whether the features are leading to them buying something, like kind of the typical funnel data that we are using. Delivery efficiency, talked already about cycle time. Automation is one of those things that is sometimes a bit harder to measure, but if you know a process, you can actually say, okay, right now we have 100 steps, and now we have 50 of them automated, and 60 and 70. So you can actually measure the number of manual steps or clicks that you need to do, or handovers, right? If you're looking for an overall delivery process, one of the really nice measures is how many handovers are there between teams or between engineers. And then we have transaction costs, which, if you heard me talking at other contests, to me, transaction cost is always that if I have a piece of software that is ready, what does it take me to bring it live? And that is things like the cost of regression testing, the cost of UAT, the cost of the deployment weekend and the release weekend. So that transaction cost is a really good measure for how efficiently you can deliver. Operations reliability, we talked already about mean time to recover, but there's also things like how many problems do we identify or through monitoring, through intelligent monitoring. I see more and more where we are taking all the data, all the log data, and all the system data to identify patterns and then react to that way before a user finds a problem. Right? So how many proactively found problems do we have versus how many are user found? Also, you could put things in there around cloud reliability and disaster recovery and failovers and how quickly those things happen. Right? So that's another thing where you can measure the overall operations reliability. And then we get to the architectural flexibility. As I said, that's a little bit harder to measure. There's simple things in here where we can look for example, technical debt, right? And technical debt sometimes is just measured by how many warnings you still have in your Sonar cube, but also how many software components you have that are not up to speed or that are outdated. There are things like how many transitions you drive into the new microservice architecture versus legacy architecture. So if you know what you're building, you should absolutely have the telemetrics in there that allows you to show where things are flowing, where's data flowing, where's user value being created in your systems, so that you can identify which part of the architecture that is going, and you can manage the flow into the thing that you're investing in. And then, which I like as well, is kind of the batch size or the average size of the releases. So that gives you a good idea of how flexibly you're moving the architecture forward. Now that's kind of a balanced scorecard, really. That is really useful at a meta level. So if you're looking at an organization, or if you're looking at a part of an organization, like a specific business unit. But there's also things that you want to look at perhaps at a team level. And at a team level, these measures are a little bit trickier to get your handle around. But there are other things that you can do. And one thing that I absolutely encourage everyone to do, even at a team level, is create a dashboard for yourself that you know what's going on, right? Because there's so many moving pieces. You don't want to rely on manually measuring things. So this is, in this case, a Splunk report, but it doesn't really matter where you build it. But you can see here code quality, build management, the automated testing progress. At the bottom, you see the releases and the impact of the releases against the reliability in production. And then you have agile measures there on the left as well. So if you plot this one out here, the release status overview, here you can look at all the different releases you have and how ready they are. So imagine if you're a team and you're not tied into a release cycle anymore, but you have all these individual components, you can see here how ready they are to be released. And then once they obviously reach the 100%, then at that point, you basically release it into production. Yeah, so you can decouple kind of from a release weekend, which is pretty useful. The other thing that you can do with teams, this is something I've used a few times, which is called a technical dependency tree. And here we're really moving away from existing maturity models into something that is, in this case, inspired by civilization. If you played computer games when you were young, like myself, I always loved that idea that you can basically choose technologies you develop and you're making progress that way, but you choose what is most relevant for you in your context. And not every civilization in this case follows the same sequence. And the same is true here. On the right-hand side, you see a technical dependency tree for continuous delivery. And as you can see, there are many, many components going into continuous delivery, but each team might choose their own path there, because for some, regression testing is really most useful right now. And so they start investing there and then do automated deployments later. Others might have the opposite. They start with automated deployments because they have lots of deployment problems, but their testing has been pretty reliable. So they might do the regression testing automation later. And so everyone can kind of choose their own path through this technical dependency tree. Something really, really useful. There's an alternative that I've used more recently, and I've used this in a couple of different organizations now, and I call it the corporate bingo card. And here the idea is there's so many different capabilities. The previous one had a very specific technical component, and they had the specific dependencies that you needed, automated deployment, automated build, automated regression testing to achieve an outcome like continuous delivery. Here we're looking at much broader context, right? So you might have things like, team structure. Here we have feature teams, and then governance, what metrics you're using, or the meeting structure that you need to agree. And you have things like a CD pipeline. You have things like specific roles. Do you have dedicated Scrum Masters? So here in this corporate bingo card, you can say, okay, for the next year, these are the capabilities that we will want to build across all our teams. And then again, you basically sit down as a coach, as a transformation lead, with each of the teams and say, which of these are most meaningful to you right now? They can choose which ones they are. You agree how you measure progress for each of these. And then as they're completing something, then you basically sit down again and say, okay, after a month or quarterly, whatever makes sense, fortnightly, you sit down and say, okay, what comes next? Now that you've achieved this, did it actually make the progress that you were hoping for? And what is the next thing that you want to do? And so you're building this over time. The parts look different for each team, but at the end, they hopefully all fill out their full bingo card or have a good reason why certain capabilities are not. But it gives guidance without over-structuring things. And as I said before, there is no one path to success. So you need to find ways that give them structure so that they're not completely lost, but also allows them flexibility to make the right decisions in their context. So now that we've figured out how we can measure progress both at the enterprise level as well as at the team level, let's go to the next bit, which is, figuring out how big a bite you can chew. And what I mean by that is there's always many, many components that play in. Like, I've not worked in organizations that only has one application. Usually there's as I said, hundreds and thousands of applications, and you're trying to figure out, if I make an impact to this application, does it actually move me forward? Or do I need to update 3 applications, or do I need to do it for the whole organization? I was just talking to a client 6 weeks ago, and they basically try to treat every application the same, right? And it becomes very quickly overwhelming, and they didn't end up making a lot of progress anymore. And that's what we're trying to figure out here. Like, how big is the bite that I can chew off right now? And here the principle starts with talking about the weakest link. You might have heard that, right? And the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So if you have tightly coupled applications, and one of them can deploy basically multiple times per hour, and the other one can only deploy once a month, the one that you can only deploy once a month is the one that you're dependent on, because as soon as you need to make a change that impacts that application, that's the speed that you will move at. So you need to look at what is the slowest moving piece or the slowest capability in your application set. And that's the one that you should improve first, because that's obviously determining how fast you can move. Now, the alternative to that is, can you find a way of decoupling it? Yeah, and so decoupling the weakest links is looking for things like API layers, so that you can figure out, okay, if I can put an API layer in here, I can change my top application quicker while the bottom one is moving slower. But I can deploy them independently, because if these things at the bottom, as long as it uses the same API, I can independently move this forward and deploy. Now, you can even do that within the application when you think about feature flags and things like that. But that's obviously, it's a quite involved mechanism, because at the end of the day, that API layer needs to be created, or that decoupling layer needs to be created first. And only then can you really do this. So that means there's an investment required for this, either on the application layer or on the API layer. Now, when we think about this, I like to call it a minimum viable cluster. And a minimum viable cluster is really finding the applications that matter. Right? So what is the smallest set of applications that I can make an impact on that still moves the organization forward? And you can see here, you have the master app, and we'll talk about how we identify that. And then we have 2 applications that usually change it at the same time. And so if I want to make a change to my master app, I very often have to make a change in app 1 or app 2 in this case here. And then there's other applications that are either completely independent, or at least you don't change them as often. So you don't necessarily have to consider them into your minimum viable cluster. And as you do that, you then start identifying a set of the applications that you then treat as a component, and you talk about the capabilities for that: automated deployment, testing, in the team structure, because that's the one where you want to have the least dependency that you need to manage in an active way. What I mean by active way is means there's a different team that I need to meet once a week, once a day, to talk about the dependencies. You want to have that in the same team, so that you're just sitting together and you're just working in the same context all the time. Now, how do you get to this master app? And this is a bit of a it's an art and a science, to be honest. I've used the same pattern now many times, and I think it works reasonably well, but it's not necessarily predictable. But the mechanism that you follow is you're getting your whole inventory of the applications, and you're going through them, and you're basically putting certain criteria against them. And here I've put out the example. So we talk about the technologies. It's useful to know whether you have different or same technologies across different applications. And then you look at criteria that makes them stand out. So is it a strategic application? Strategic applications are applications that impact your customers. They're applications that drive a lot of your business value. They're applications that potentially run kind of really important back of house transactions. Then you talk about frequency of change. Frequency of change is how often do you want to change this one? Like, is it something that evolves a lot, or is it something pretty stable? And then the last thing that you look at is the size of the application in the investment portfolio. So how much money are we spending on this application in the next 12 months? Yeah, is it something that you're investing a lot of money and time into? Or is it an application that we are, potentially that belongs to a part of the business that we are selling off, or that we don't want to invest in anymore? So based on those three, and you can give them pretty much like an agile sizing, from like t-shirt sizing or Fibonacci numbers. And based on that, you then end up with, an application rating. Now, once you have that application rating, you pick the first application, and then you go back to what we had on the previous one. You're saying, now I have this master app. Now I look at which applications are tightly coupled with this master app. And then you pull them into the same wave. And then you look at, okay, now that I have this new minimum viable cluster, in this case, the master app, app 1 and app 2, are there any other applications that they depend on? And you do this until you get to a certain minimum set. If that first set doesn't work out, you can then go back and say, okay, the first application didn't work. Let me take application 2 and pull that one up. And if you pull that one up, perhaps that gives you a minimum viable cluster that you can deal with. And then you move on and on. What that does, it really gives you a specific scope that you're dealing with. And ideally gives you a scope that is very, very meaningful because it drives a specific business outcome and a specific set of functionality, or it drives a specific business perhaps. And that might be another way of looking at this. But these clusters are then very specific, and you can talk about the capability uplift for that. And now you can measure, how quickly can I deliver this? How quickly can I run regression testing on that? All of these are measures that you can use to measure progress for these individual minimum viable clusters. Now, that doesn't always work this way. So it's not always that you're going after just that first set of applications. And I just want to make you a little bit sensitized to that, because realistically, you're doing this in a big organization. And sometimes you just need to pick the application that someone very important cares about. They're one of your key stakeholders, your key supporters. So you want to make sure that one of their applications is also getting a treatment up front. And so that's very often the case. And we would be stupid to ignore that, to be honest, because, as much as we like to say, all of these things are being equal, in organization, politics play a role. And you want to use that. You want to make sure that you're working towards that. I was working with an organization where the DevOps initiative was funded by the quality engineering department. Now, of course, we had to then invest in test automation, even though there might have not been the most important thing. So we had to make sure that we are doing something to show that this capability or the stakeholder is getting some value from this investment, while still doing things that matters in other areas. Another thing might be that you want to set an example, a lighthouse project. Right? So these clusters might be really complicated. They have SAP or Oracle or Salesforce, and they're difficult to deal with. But you want to show people the power of what you're trying to do. So you might pick up a digital application and really invest in those capabilities so that you can showcase the power of DevOps and doing dozens and dozens of deployments a day or hundreds of deployments or whatever. And that's also useful because it just shows people what's possible. And that can be very, very powerful in an organization. And then the third one is, if there is something in there where they've already made good progress, and they just need that help for the last mile, that would then make a really meaningful impact, then that's also something to consider, right? So these 3 dimensions are things that you want to think about just to make sure that you're not completely mechanistically going through this. These are transformations. Transformations are based on many different parties and stakeholders having a stake in what you're doing. So even if you have the right answer, remember what I said up front, there's never one right way to do things. Right? So even the process that I described just then, I break my own process because of these 3 things here, and because I think they help me in the overall journey. And that's important. Like sometimes a slower step or a step slightly backwards or to the side can help you make more progress in the long run. And that's important to consider. All right. So now we get into the main course, focusing on the right things. So now we've identified the application cluster or the application itself that we want to invest in, and that will potentially have the biggest impact on what we can do going forward. So how do I focus on the right things for that application? How do I know how that works? Now, the very first thing is to use a value stream map. Now, you can see here quite a very traditional way of doing a value stream map, which is you're getting into the same room with all the stakeholders in the organization, and you put sticky notes onto a whiteboard. Yeah, and then on the basis of that, you identify the process that you're going through and where challenges are. So what you see here is you see white post-it notes. They're describing the process steps. You can see some arrows if you look really closely, but that just shows you how things flow through these processes. And then you see these colorful sticky notes. Now here, the red or pink sticky notes are the areas that we addressed, that we identified as challenges. You would say, like, oh my God, there's so many red sticky notes. That is good news, because that means that all the different opportunities that we have. Doesn't mean that we're going to do them all, right? So we're just documenting where do we see individual challenges. Now, this is in the traditional context. Over the last 18 months, as you can imagine, I ended up doing this in virtual scenarios. And to be honest, it is a bit harder, but it still works reasonably well, right? So we use things like Miro boards or Miro boards, and you can still do it quite well. But if you're doing that, it's really worthwhile making sure that you're familiar with the tools, play it through a little bit, because it's a little bit less intuitive, and you need to facilitate it very differently. If you're in the same room, you can get through this in 2 90-minute sessions with a break in the middle, and you can probably get through a decent sized value stream map. Online, we actually are breaking it up over multiple days. And part of that is that it's much harder for people to pay that much attention. Part of it is that you need to prepare a bit more. So after the first step of gathering information, you then want to take that away and prepare it a little bit and sort it a little bit more, so that next time when they look at it, it's a bit easier to consume, right? Because you're not sharing necessarily the same context as you do when you're in the same room together. So if you're doing it virtually, just be conscious that you need to do a little bit more preparation, and that you really need to think about the facilitation timing and the activities in a way that allows people who don't see each other, who don't sit in the same room, to still collaborate. One thing that's very often happening is when you do this, and that happens in the room or virtually, is all these questions that you have, like, where in the process do we do this specific thing? Or wait a second, I know that we are normally getting an environment procured here, but does anyone know exactly what process we're using for that? Now, if you're in the same room, that's very often easy to resolve. Like, you can call someone in, or just call them in the first place. If you do this virtually, it seems to be quite a bit harder. So at that point, you might actually make the call to say, okay, there's a specific area that we do in a breakout. If you do that physically, you would normally not do that. You would try to resolve it in the room, but virtually, you might have certain areas of the value stream map that you fill in later, and you do an offline conversation to move that forward. Once you've done this first facilitation session, you then can get to a documented process, and you can see here ultimately something like video we use very often. An alternative virtual tool because it allows us to reuse elements of the process going forward and break it up in different components. But it's important to document it, because once you have that, if you then come back in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, you can then see how this has changed. And I mean, the whole goal of transformation is to change these processes. Yeah, whether it's through automation or whether it's to just process improvement or by resolving conflicts or consolidating accountability so that you're much more streamlined. And then the last step for that is, once you've then identified what is the bit that is most important to you, and you can do this through voting in the room, you can do this through a facilitation of interviews with stakeholders, but you will at some stage figure out, okay, if we make progress here, that's the one that will most likely have an impact for the end-to-end value stream. Like, it's the most important bottleneck. It's the important one where we lose quality, where we have real quality concerns and we start to do a lot of rework. Yeah, once you have that, you need to drill into this to really drive down, if we change something, how do we see that we are addressing the specific bottleneck or area of concern? In this scenario here, that was in the deployment process. And you can see a little diagram there at the bottom that shows you how we measure that. But I blow it up for you so that you can see it a bit better. So here we had this is a very specific example, right? And it's perhaps a little bit too much information on the screen, but I want to just show you the principle of diving deep so that you can identify the progress that you're making for a specific capability. So here you see deployment process. It starts with in this case, with an email. It says we're taking this environment down. Then there are specific pre-preparation steps. Then there's ideally a pre-check that we're ready to do the deployment, doing the deployment itself. We then do some post-validation, and then we send an email out that we're good to go. The environment is available again. What you can see here is a few different pieces of information. You see with the red X process steps that are not actually executed, right? So we've identified gaps in the process. And so here's something that we want to start doing. At the top, you see failure rates, right? And so you see failure rates of, in this case, 15% and 10%. So here we want to see that failure rate going down. You see where we have these kind of half green and gray bars, that shows us how much automation we have. And we see that in the legend on the right-hand side. So the fuller a bar is, the more we have automation implemented. Now that gives us the automation measure. And then at the bottom, you see cycle time. You see how long do these steps actually take. You can see the cycle time end to end, and you see then the prep time, deploy time, and validation time. Now, this specific measure, we have identified all of this big value stream map, that deployment is one of our key areas of concern. Then we drove this down to the specific process that we want to use for the deployment process. All right, and so you have all these steps here. We can identify the gaps. We can identify the reliability of this, and that could be manual or automated. We've identified the level of automation, and we've identified the cycle time. Now, as we are now making progress, we can bring this exact diagram up with a number of different stakeholders, with the teams, with the executives, and we can show how the investment that we are making is making an impact. And many of these things you can translate into costs or impacts if you wanted to. At some stage, that overall cycle time or the overall reliability is improving. And once you're improving that, and you're saying, okay, I think we have made enough progress here, then you go back to this end-to-end process and say, okay, well, this area has improved now. We have a bit of extra capacity now, or we are, this seems to be stabilizing. Where do we move next? And this can be both on the existing process map that you've already created here, the existing value stream map, or you at that point decide, let's do another one. Because one thing that changes, and that's quite amazing, organizations are pretty close to natural organisms, because when things change, things react to it. And so you start seeing certain things changing in the end-to-end processes because we're making this change in that specific, in this case, the deployment process. Or because people start getting behind this and starting to, at the same point, do some investment in test automation, or they change the team structure, or they change the governance structure to be much more relaxed or more rigorous or more fine-grained or whatever. Right? So you want to then take this step back and say, let's do this exercise again. Like, we don't want to get stuck with the same map that might be already overcome. And spending half a day on doing another value stream map after 3 or 6 months is always a good investment. So that brings us then to the last one, and that's the bonus, the dessert, the cheesecake if you are me, because that would be my choice. And that's the power of documentation. And I would have never guessed that that's a topic I speak about. Right? So I was, but pretty much since I was in uni, I was an engineer. And as engineers, we have that kind of thinking that, why would I spend time writing things down in a Word document? Like, I'm writing code. And that's where I really should invest my time in, and we have documentation as code. Now, I've learned my lesson there, because I think there's quite an interesting thing to think about when we start talking about documentation. So let's go through this a little bit. So the first thing is, for me, documentation, and I've come to realize that, it's a democratization of code. Right? If I'm working with a team, I'm an SAP person, and I'm working with the guys in the Java world. If I ask the Java person to read my ABAP code that I potentially have documented, what I'm really saying is to these guys, you guys, good luck. They might not understand that. And then I can feel powerful because, I have to explain it to them. But really, what is happening is I'm putting barriers around me where only people who are part of my tribe can understand what I'm doing. Yeah, and that is very, very misleading, and it's very, it's not optimal in an organization, because what you want to do is you want for people to understand what you're doing. Yeah, and I've seen this from the DevOps team, who are the only ones who understand the Jenkins structure, because ultimately they haven't documented anything readable. I learned this when I go in. I'm reasonably technical, although I don't write a lot of code these days. But if I want to understand how something works, I will always start with documentation first, the diagram on a whiteboard, normally, right? You get people in and they document something on a whiteboard. But that means that other people can start understanding it. A business stakeholder might understand your application if it's reasonably well documented in high-level diagrams. If you want to explain it to another team, if you want to agree on interfaces or how things are meant to be working together, you can't just talk about it. You can't just show them code. You have to be able to visualize something. And that is so, so, so important, because remember what we did in the previous step. We went back and we created a value stream map to show the overall process. And that's not because we don't know what we are doing. When everyone can tell us we create a business case, and then we create requirements or user stories, then we're implementing it, we're creating an environment. They all know that. But once you put it on paper and you visualize it and you see it, everyone in the room understands how these things fit together. The testers understand how the developers work, and the developers understand how the environments are getting built. And all of a sudden, they're seeing opportunities, they're seeing changes, they're seeing where we can do things better. And that doesn't happen when you ask them to bring up the Terraform code for the environment, and the Selenium code for the test automation, and the ABAP code for SAP, right? So if we want to solve big systems problems, we need to have a level of documentation that allows everyone to understand that system and to then contribute to the solution. And that is something that I realized when you get into really technical organizations, they very often don't have that. And they basically cementing the silos they have around the applications by only having that kind of super technical documentation that people outside of their silos don't understand. So that's I thought is something that I've only learned by working with really, really technical organizations over the last 3 years. There's another thing. Documentation is actually good for the developer too. Now, I will admit, when I write code, or when I used to write code, I would immediately go in and just start coding. Right? I have the structure in my head, and I would just start coding this stuff out. And the thing is, if you force yourself to write things down of how things are meant to work, you will find a lot of problems that you don't find when you write code. Because when you write code, it's a little bit like what they say, when you're in a certain way of thinking. You're only thinking about the stuff that you're doing, and you're not necessarily thinking about the side conditions or how things depend on each other. You can easily, in a discussion with someone, have a circular argument where you're disagreeing with yourself, and perhaps, over a drink or so with your friends, you would have realized that sometimes. So you're arguing something, and then all of a sudden you're ending in a point where you've disagreed with your point that you tried to make originally. That doesn't happen when you're writing things down, because when you're writing things down, you're forcing yourself to create something within a structure, a white piece of paper, a Word document, a whiteboard. And as soon as you're starting to write this down, certain problems with your thinking, or lack of clarity or ambiguities, become apparent. And that makes your solution much stronger. Yeah. It's the way of communicating something that changes something. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague of mine the other day, where it's like, I called him up and I said, I need a technical teddy bear. And he's like, what is a technical teddy bear? I'm like, it is. I used to do that when I was in uni. I basically had this teddy bear that I got from my girlfriend back then, and I would explain to that teddy bear what I'm trying to code, and just by vocalizing it and by kind of showing to the teddy bear what I was doing, it forced me to think differently about what I was doing, and it allowed me to identify problems with it. And that's the same thing that is true when you're writing things down for someone else, when you're presenting something onto a whiteboard. And obviously, the more structure that is, the better it is to use going forward. So that's real power for the developer, not just for the others. And this is the ultimate bit at the end, is it is a form of an interface to other teams. Think about this, we talk about APIs. And to me, documentation is very much that as well. So we have all these different teams, and those teams building their own components, right? Whether it's an application architecture, or when we talk about DevOps, as I said, like if you're thinking about a reasonably mature DevOps setup, you have cloud infrastructure, you have application infrastructure, like middleware, like databases. You have the applications themselves, so the binaries that belong to the application. You have application configuration, that is the things that the teams develop. You have data, either static reference data, or transactional data, or testing data. These are all different components. Now, if we want to make sure these work together going forward, documentation can really help us with that. You can say, okay, here's the end-to-end process. Here's how we're docking in. Remember back when I was talking about the CD pipeline example at the beginning of the talk, right? That was exactly what we did. We all intuitively knew how this stuff would fit together. And we had very specific technical documentation. But we needed to then take ourselves a step up and create a documentation that showed how this end-to-end flows and how the use cases are for what we're trying to do, right? There are applications where we have a packaged application where all we can do is kind of consume a binary and deploy it as a big blob. Then we had other applications that were more microservice-based, and they have a very different structure of how we would deploy them, or containers, when we talk about Docker containers and Kubernetes. So documenting that in a way that we said, okay, as across the teams, here's how we operate. Here are the individual bits that dock into that. That is very, very powerful, and not something you can do just by code. I've tried this, where we basically just give APIs to people, but then they might be very, very specific, or they're not contextual enough, or there's misunderstandings there. And you can alleviate it sometimes by having working interfaces so that you can test it against a stub or something like that. But overall, having something visual and something documented that you can use as kind of interface agreements is a lot more powerful. There is another element in there that you're going to change things, right? And your teams will change, your applications will change. And over time, it becomes so important to understand why you did certain things, right? So I've seen organizations where they ended up with even documented architectures, and then you go back and go, but why did you choose this pattern? And then no one knows why. And then you're trying you're doing certain things, or you're changing that, and all of a sudden something happens, and yeah, that's why we used this pattern, because this other thing didn't work here, or the performance of that was not good enough. And again, that organizational knowledge is very difficult to capture. And so thinking about how you get this as part of your documentation is crucial. Yeah, and we are working in organizations now, and I'm not sure whether no matter where you are in the world, you might have realized that the technology space is the marketplace is hot, right? So if you just look at the churn we have with developers in many organizations, that means you have to deal with potentially in 3 or 5 years a whole agile team being replaced by different people, one by one, not the whole team goes, but one person leaves, a new person comes in, one person leaves, a new person comes in, and 3 or 4 or 5 years later, no one from the original team is there, and no one remembers why certain things were done and how certain things were structured. And so having something permanent that allows you to capture that is very, very important. And then the last point, and I'm very, very passionate about that one, is that technical documentation should also speak to the processes. So what do I mean by that? So many organizations have specific technical documentation that here's the application architecture, or here's the infrastructure architecture, or the infrastructure design. Here's the the cloud component that we've used in many of the Azure and AWS diagrams. Use these kind of normalized diagrams with the icons from them, and that's great. It gives us a common language. It gives us a common understanding of the components we use, but it doesn't necessarily tell me how we're using certain things, right? And that's both from a DevOps perspective, where I want to understand what the overall processes that we are using, nor does it speak to the business process that we are supporting. This gets worse in many organizations where you're not fully automated, right? So we have certain manual steps in between, and yet if I pick up the application documentation or the architecture documentation, it only speaks to the thing that we've implemented. It doesn't speak to all these gaps around that, the manual processes that are feeding it, the steps in between that you can also optimize. And so if we are not doing that, how can we then make sure that the next person picks it up and understands why we build this way, or why the application behaves this way, or where the problems come from when they're fed from the manual process incorrectly? And many optimization opportunities lie actually in the process in which these applications or systems are being used. So if we don't speak to that, we are really losing a really important aspect. I've been working on in a program where we have a design authority that looks at the way that we are building cloud-based applications. And because many of the applications were in the data center at the moment, the documentation of the designs are basically cloud designs. And without understanding of how we're going to use these cloud-based applications in which context, and context is rich here, right? Because there's certain data flows, it's an international organization, so you have different data authorities. You can't just pick all these individual design components and put them together and then hope that they are supporting your business. You have to really understand how things flow. And so as part of the design authority, it's actually looking at, how we're making this decision and what process are these embedded in. And we're actually creating process designs, even from a technical perspective. We're even doing this for migrations. So that we're saying, as we're moving applications from the data center into the cloud, what does the actual migration process look like? And what are the technical components for that? And the decisions we are driving. So at what point do we choose specific cloud components or specific migration tools? Yeah. And all of these things are as much a design concern, are as much technical documentation as the actual application or infrastructure itself. Yeah. And so many organizations don't really treat it that way. They treat it as a process, a BA can do it all, And I think that makes it very, very challenging going forward, because there's so many variables and decisions that you're driving, that to get to some level of consistency and forcing people through that thought process, you do need to document these things out. So if you're working in a big organization, I highly encourage you to rethink the strategy around documentation. Not too much, but definitely not too little. And very strongly focusing on visuals, on processes, and on flows, rather than on componentry. Componentry doesn't add as much value, but how all this fits into the context That's where the power is. So what do we take away from this? I mean, you can see here is, if you're chewing the whole elephant at one time, you're gonna be sick, right? So you're gonna get a tummy ache. I have a 4-year-old at home. I can tell you how uncomfortable that is when they eat too much gummy bears or whatever it is, cake. So look in your enterprise transformation for small things, for minimum viable cluster, for the one area in the value stream where the capabilities improve, for the individual experiments that you can drive to move you forward along the dimensions of the balanced scorecard that we talked about, for the teams to find things that they can do for their individual bingo card, or for their technical tree, for their civilization technology tree. And don't forget that you want to create this kind of trail and visualization that allows other people to follow your footpath, so that other people understand what's going on, and you can bring more people on this journey by having the right level of documentation. And so if you do that, and you take one step at a time, you will be able to make a huge amount of progress on your journey. It's easy to say one step at a time. I think the key here is one conscious step at a time, so that it's not just wasted effort, but something that is meaningful in the context of your organization. And if you do that, you can see that you're making progress. You can get more people on this journey. You might be walking alone initially, but then more and more people will join you, and it's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. It's going to be a very exciting journey, and you're going to be able to celebrate success together. And that's what keeps me in this. I've been doing it with many different organizations now, and it's honestly the best job ever. So hopefully I could give you a little bit of my experience. Hopefully there's a little bit in there that you can take away to your organization, to your team, to your clients. And hopefully very, very soon we will be able to meet in person again at one of these conferences and exchange our experiences. So thank you very much for spending the time with me. I'm very much looking forward to the other talks, and hope you're having a fantastic conference. Thank you so much.